name is Julie Tomiak. I'm Anishinaabe on my mother's side. She's from the Swisha on the Kitchissippi between Pembroke and Mattawa. And I teach in the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University. And it is my honor to introduce the speakers for this next panel on 3 eras of treaty making and breaking in settler colonial Canada. And given the ongoing breach, the ongoing non-implementation of treaties by the Crown, it is important to think about what implementation based on Indigenous legal orders and international law would look like. So how do existing and new or newer treaties provide a framework for sovereignty and defending lands and waters? And what, if any, common conceptual or jurisdictional ground exists within a capitalist, territorially acquisitive settler state? So these are some of the questions that will be addressed in this panel. Other key questions relate to the changing or unchanging nature of extinguishment clauses and the future of implementation. So can treaties, so-called historic and modern treaties, at long last offer a tangible and progressive framework for nation-to-nation relationships, and what needs to happen to ensure that the spirit and intent of treaties is understood and reflected in the governance of treaty relationships and responsibilities. And again, it is such an honor to introduce the speakers, Sylvia McAdam, Catherine Minich, and Norman Matchwan, who is still on his way, and we hope that he can join us soon. I will briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions and comments. And the idea is that we wrap up at around 4:45. Catherine Minich, the first speaker, is an Inuk from Pangnaktung in the Nunavut territory, and she is currently completing a PhD in policy studies at Ryerson University, where she studies the intergenerational knowledge transmission and Inuit Kauyimaya Tungangit, which in Inuktitut probably sounds very different, of policy processes for freshwater resources, including unique methods of harvesting icebergs. Catherine has extensive experience working for provincial and national Indigenous nonprofit organizations. The next speaker is Sylvia McAdam from Treaty 6 lands. Sylvia has her law degree from the University of Saskatchewan. She's the co-founder of an Indigenous-led resistance called Idle No More. You may have heard of it. Sylvia is also co-founder of One House, Many Nations, that designs off-the-grid sustainable shelters to raise awareness about the epidemic of unacceptable houselessness in a wealthy state like Canada, especially among Indigenous and LGBTQ people. Idle No More has been selected for several awards, namely the Carol Geller Human Rights Award, Foreign Policy Top 100 Global Thinkers 2014 Award, Social Justice Award, and the 2014 Global Citizen Award. Recently, Sylvia was selected by the Margulies National Design for Living Prize. So I'll turn it over to Catherine, our first speaker.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Julia. So in Inuktitut, a caribou is a tuktu, and Pangnaktu, which is the community I'm from, is place of the bull-headed caribou. So I just thought I'd share that image with you. All right, well, like many others here, I too want to express my gratitude to the Haudenosaunee and to the Anishinaabe for welcoming me to this gathering to offer this space with you today as an audience, and my fellow panelists with whom I am really grateful to be among. I'm gonna hang this up. Okay, I've lectured here in the Indigenous Studies program for almost 2 years, and it's really been under the guidance of Vanessa and of Rick, Dawn, and Chelsea. Not only are they wonderful people, but their critical intellectual work is really powerful to observe. But I also come to you as my role as a PhD student in progress. I am mid-proposal. I'm getting it done. After bouncing off several ideas as well with Hayden King, and now with the support of my supervisory committee for my home institution of Ryerson University. So talk about being in the right place at the right time, right? Ryerson, McMaster, all together. Okay, so I want to situate my work in policy that is in essence about freshwater in the Arctic. As an Inuk scholar, I hail from the Oquimute area, which is all of South Baffin Island, like all of South Baffin Island, right? Not just one little town, but all of South Baffin Island, where my mother's family then settled in the community of Pangnirtung. If anybody's been there, you know these iconic mountains. It's a fjord. And Pangnirtung is just south of the Arctic Circle, but one flight north of Iqaluit in Nunavut. The freshwater in the Arctic, it doesn't face large-scale threats. We have lots of rivers. We have coastal access. We have a self-government. We have public and birthright institutions. And we have a growing Inuit workforce. We also have permanent observer status with major nation states like Russia, the United States of America, Norway. And you want me to be louder? Okay. Okay. Just talk a little closer. She always has to give me instructions. Very explicit instructions. So as Inuit, we have permanent observer status with major nation states like Russia and the United States of America, including Norway. And we have many, many Arctic scientists who plot and they study and they analyze climate change. And they really see that Inuit are the face of post-industrial destruction of the natural world. We have a national Inuit organization, an international Inuit organization, and it really does seem like we have a say. But despite this long list of haves, there are things that Inuit are without. Inuit children are without food. Inuit hunters are without market access for their seal furs. Big shout out to Alethea Arnakuk-Barrel for Angry Inuk in this one. Inuit women are without personal safety because of their sex. And many Inuit youths are without a future because they die by suicide. So despite this long list of haves and have-nots, they are really incongruent. Well-educated scientists will ask for a double dividend. They say that we need to improve the quality of life in communities because it's foundational to the communities where they are working. Well-intentioned bureaucracies, because Canada's so nice, either from territorial or federal governments, engage in layered incrementalism and that they control the growth of the Inuit public service and they give us 5- and 10-year trends of public service growth. And advocacy organizations are really busy, doing busy work to get programs off the ground. Last summer, Inuvialuit scholar Piers Krapps and I, and you saw him earlier today, we combed through 10 years of annual reports from Inuit organizations. And we looked at these reports between 2006 and 2016. But unfortunately, we had to exclude the Labrador Inuit Association in this analysis because they were dissolved in 2006 once they signed their self-government agreement. So we wanted to look at how leadership, well, I wanted to look, and then I asked Piers to look for these things. We looked at how leadership narrated their reports, and then we also looked for trends in financial information. And I swear this has like lots of good information in here about water, but I'll skip there. So we felt that self-government documents from Nunatsiavut would not be an adequate comparison, so we also like that added to our exclusion criteria. But to make the analysis more manageable and comparative, we really limited the narrative analysis to the voices of the presidents or the chairs of the organizations and just their financial statements that were in those annual reports. And we found some interesting facts. So while there's several approaches to understanding governance practices of Inuit, the narratives in the president sections of the annual reports and the financial data were interpreted against an Inuit framework. Along with this approach come several assumptions about the value of the narrative, the position of these organizations in a legal context, as well as the political and social values contained within those organizational structures. So the Inuit framework that we were using was IQ, Inuit Qauyamaya Tukanit. So that was really close, Julia. So both as Inuit scholars and students, we felt that this approach was going to be the most informative for this analysis. And so we asked ourselves, some real important question here. What and how is the governing principle of Piliraqatiarnik, and how is that used by the leaders in their communication to membership? So this is a principle that talks about doing things for the common good. Other Arctic scholars, non-Indigenous, non-Inuit, for example, Wilson and Alcantara studied Inuit economic development corporations and showed how they were advantageous for Aboriginal self-government. But we take the view that self-government is not an endpoint, but just a political moment. An underlying assumption that we value in this work is to draw from the expressions of how the IQ values and principles, even those in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So first, the narrative framework and what I wanted to look at in the reports. So two things that guided the project were, one was a proxy about what's a core policy belief. So what do you believe is going to happen and how should this policy go? And another important part is the strategy. So how is it and who's talking and how do they pivot different types of information? So I was borrowing something from a narrative policy framework, and it really does look at characters and the causal explanations that are voiced in there. Do you guys remember this? This is like Dudley Do-Right, I think, right? So there's an RCMP method, and it used to be on the Brocky and Bullwinkle show. But this is to identify some of the strategies that are used in this kind of analysis because it really promotes the use of heroes, victims, and villains. And another draw for this framework approach is its use of evidence. So as I mentioned, there are many, many Arctic scientists who believe that they can improve the conditions in the community and they want to draw on a double dividend for social and then environment so they can make some progress on understanding climate change. And so the narrative policy framework, it helps to explain the use of evidence. So it'll draw into science and it'll use science to prop up their policy beliefs that they're promoting. So in the analysis that follows looking at the narrative policy framework, we suggest that looking at who is responsible for the actions and the kinds of activities and who carries the blame or who suffers and what is being done to overcome that issue. So in these narratives, we know that Inuit organizations own parts of the problems and actively try to address what needs to be overcome. And here's some of our findings. So in the IRC, which is the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, we see that the global economy is what carries the blame. So it was the financial crisis. And we see how they then later on in subsequent years really do talk about adopting a very conservative physical strategy. In Makivik, which is northern Quebec, we see some shifts between internal and external attributes. We see to understand who is responsible for the conditions in northern Quebec, in Nunavik. And some of those things that they talk about is air access. So if there's flights accessible in communities, the deplorable housing conditions and overcrowdedness, and then the poor status of the houses. Community infrastructure, the relocation apology, and taxation credits are some of the things that Makivik talks about. Interestingly, for NTI, which is the Nunavut Tungavik Incorporation, we observed that the activities completed to overcome one of the main issues that they honed in on for many years was the Inuit unemployment in Nunavut. In early 2006, they raised the issue and subsequently undertook activities to resolve it through organizational means. So it addressed the federal government by taking them to court and finally moved from their settlement to create a training corporation. One of the problems that highlights for me is that now this lack of, if Nunatsiavut had dissolved their Inuit association, who's going to do that for them when their agreements and self-government isn't being implemented as they see fit? So other things that resonate across all of the Inuit organizations is the high-profile meetings and connecting with other Inuit regions. So that calls into some of the IQ principles of wanting to work together. And one of the last overarching commonalities between all the land claim was working on the negotiation of the various land claim agreements because they're at various stages of development. The financial analysis, right? Here we go. On the financial analysis, it's such little amounts. It's really small. So in Makivik, it was about $3 to $5 million a year per year that we were able to allocate for. And the other places a bit more, but they counted different things than they did. So there's not uniformity across the Inuit organizations in terms of what it is that they themselves, not as a self-government, but as an Inuit association, what is it that they're supporting and how they're doing that. Makivik is the only one that explicitly says that they manage the compensation money from their land claim agreement. And in their $3 to $5 million a year, they account for making community donations, cultural activities, and youth and elder activities. So these are things that would otherwise not be a part of their community level actions. So this kind of corporate money is really important because this is where, potentially we can read self-determination. This is what self-determination can look like. Is it something that's being driven by their membership and by Inuit leadership? The largest sum of money that NTI pays is to the regional Inuit associations, followed by money to their employees, costs for travel, which were in excess of $3 million, I must add, in one year of the annual reports, and any top-up benefits. And these are things like bereavement, travel, or childcare subsidies. So in future, I think I'd like to dig into some of more of the regional Inuit associations to see how they spent their funds. But to start wrapping up, do another stage here. I hope I can bring you back to the Arctic freshwater, because it's what's gotten me here. But I really do need to point out the policy gaps that are in place. And I see my research bridging these disparate realities between the Inuit perspective and the non-Inuit perspectives from whatever seat they occupy, if they're in the government, if they're analysts or officers or biologists, anthropologists, climatologists. So Arctic freshwater is the entry point for my research, and I will study the narrative of co-management in Nunavut and compare the outcomes between 2 or more community-level processes where local freshwater sources are under pressure. The pressures of their water sources come from demographic growth. The original settlements are double or triple the original infrastructure, creating both a quantity challenge and with greater quality challenges as well. So a few of the objectives for my research will include to study the viability of the government of Nunavut's Inuit Kalyamaya policy and co-management mandate for their water board, to study the narrative processes and strategies that underlie the freshwater licensing and regulations in Nunavut, and to compare the types of different, this is kind of funny, to compare types of water pressures, but not like the literal water pressure in the community. And this here is the community of Pond Inlet. So this is one of the community sites. The other is Baker Lake in Nunavut. And because Pond Inlet is so far north on Baffin Island, icebergs that break off from Greenland do drift down. And so sometimes boats will try to use the currents and nudge the iceberg closer to town so that when in the wintertime when it freezes, this resource of fresh water via iceberg is still there for them to enjoy. Well, thank you for your attention.
So, mste nanaskumun ipi mamaupa ya hutanos kagiskag minagsimantu nanaskumao igwa kaniop tsugugisguok minakigawinoski minakakiop tatamskat no. What I just said was really beautiful. I just thankful to be here on these Indigenous lands, and I'm thankful we've gathered here, and I'm thankful to the Creator and the Four Directions and our Mother Earth and all the lands. I'm grateful to come here and speak with all of you. So there's one thing that I want to share, that we just recently lost my mom here, but the thing about my family is that I speak my language today because when the priests and the Indian agent came for the children, my parents were hidden away. And then the same thing with my grandparents. They were hidden away when they came for the children. But there's layers of stories that I am unable and I don't have time to share here. Just know that the lands that I'm going to speak about here today, when the Indian agents and the priests came for the children, some of the children ran away, and some of them knew when they were running that they would possibly die. And they did. They died, and my people buried them where they died. And so these lands are sacred to me on so many levels. And this is where Idle No More began for me. Excuse me. I'm just recovering from a cold. And so while I was out there, and the loss that I'm going to touch on is what drove me and guided me. And my mother is Anishinaabe, but where I am, we call them Nahkawinoak. And my mother always referred to herself as Nahko School. And my grandmother was full-blooded Anishinaabe woman. And she was from Big Bear's tribe, or Big Bear's people. And my father is full-blooded Cree. I have a great-grandfather, his name is Tom McBride, and he's Scottish. So if you need any information about Scottish people, I'm the expert. Just a quick jab at that. So I'm not going to focus too long on these teachings. Just know that we were given our laws from Ksimantu. And when Wisakitak went to the hills to meet with Ksimantu, the hills that are now referred to in the English language as Cypress Hills, in my language, Ogamawaskoti. And that's where Wisakitak went and spoke with the Creator, and he came, and it was the women that met him. And the women took him to the lodges of Okitsitau School Kamgwa, the lodges of the women. And these women are very instrumental at the time of treaty making. And it was the women that carried the laws. And I knew this. I grew up with this. I was raised to understand my people's laws. And for lack of a better word, and there's limitations to the English language, I'll call them laws for now. But in my language, after Wisakitak transferred and transmitted them over to the women, we understood Manto Wingiuna. Manto Wingiuna are all the laws of creation. Even the animals have laws, the trees, the plants, the earth, the water. They all have laws that they have been given. And no human being can say they know all the laws. Then you're saying that you're Ksimantu, right? And then that's not possible. Maybe when you make your journey to the spirit world, you will have at least a tiny inkling of what the laws are. For today, I'm going to touch on the laws that my mother taught me and spoke about. And these are Anishinaabe laws as well. And if you have read my book, it's called Nationhood Interrupted, Revitalizing Nihio Legal Systems. I speak about these laws there in detail. And today, I will touch on a few of them. The human law was given to us at the time when you're born. And when you're born, and you can read this teaching in my book if you have a chance to read my book. There's 4 gifts that a child is born with. My nation believes we're born with 4 gifts: the emotional, the spiritual, the mental, and the physical. And I always use the physical as an example. Like, take for instance the water that we're drinking. It nourishes our body. We feel good. We can't live without water. And if you drink contaminated water, your body will suffer. It will suffer. And that's the same with all the other gifts, what we feed our children. The emotional is fed by our kinship systems. And in my language, we call the kinship systems wakutuin, but there's another term, wakumtuin. There's an M in there, wakumtuin. And that particular kinship is connected to the word mihko. That's where the M is from, mihko. And that's the blood kinship. And there's not too many people that talk about that, but there's 2 kinship laws. But for today, I'm going to focus on the first one, wakutuin, and that's how we're related to everything. And our children, when they're born with these 4 gifts, how we feed them is fed by wakutuin and wakumtuin. And the spiritual, the mental, this is what I'm doing with you right now. I'm feeding your mental gift, the mental part of you, I'm feeding it with the information that I'm sharing with you today. And when we feed our children these powerful and sacred information and teachings, we're replacing the colonial information that they've been indoctrinated with. And that's what I think people like to call that decolonization or indigenizing our young people. And so that's what I try to do as much as I can. I take my granddaughters to the lands, and my granddaughters, they say to me, and they'll play in the sand. Our lands are so incredibly beautiful. And they'll take a handful of the sand, and then they'll tell me, Nukum, these are our lands, right? And I'm like, yep, these are our lands. And so that's how I'm feeding them. I'm nourishing them with our laws and feeding them with our kinship. For today, I'm going to touch on the human laws. Nihio Uyasuuna. Nihio Uyasuuna. In English, those are the Cree laws, but they're also the Anishinaabe laws, because my mom assisted with the information that I write in the book. Now there's 4 core laws, and I'm trained in the colonial law, so the first example that I can connect it that's similar to it is that actus rea and the mens rea, the guilty mind and the guilty act. That's similar to these 4 laws are similar to that. When you break a law, and then after you break that law, then it's identified which law it is that you broke. But you have to do that act of breaking a law. And that's what Baastahuin is. Baastamuin, Ochiniuin, Ochinimuin. And I knew this when I was out on the land during, I don't know more. Baastahuin is, and I'm going to tell a quick story. That's how the One House, Many Nations that I don't know more is a part of. Anyway, I ran for chief. I always have stories. I like stories. I ran for chief. Holy smokes, I'll never do that again. Holy smokes. Violent, man. Oh my, but I won't, that's a different topic. I won't talk about that. Holy smokes. Anyway, and I'm not a politician by any stretch of the imagination, but my little brain figured out that I had to go door to door because I watched it on TV. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go door to door. Never do that on election month. Never do that, because I ended up finding children alone, without food, in some houses, without electricity. And of course, I gathered up my own children who are grown, and we would go feed and haul food. But there was this one story, and it was like those the shanties that we see on TV from Africa and those different nations, right? Well, I thought it was a chicken coop with a door, but there was a vehicle parked there. I thought, what the heck? So I drove up there, and I knocked on a door, and I hear this voice, "Bit degree." I'm like, okay, so I open up this rickety door, And sure enough, there's this man sitting there. And I swear, I walked in there and the roof is like caving in. It was like he dug a hole in the ground and slapped some boards together. And I sat down with him, and then he started telling me that he had been homeless for 16 years. I was stunned. And I told him, even if I don't get in for chief, I'll try and do something, because my voice is kind of loud. But it's not really my voice, it's I don't know more, but I just kind of wanted to brag a little bit. And so I didn't get in for chief. Misogyny, patriarchy, colonization, firmly entrenched in my reserve. When I ran for chief, I was told in a language, women don't belong in leadership, you go home and make bannock. That's what they told me. And so this gentleman, I didn't get in, and the next few days, I went to these amazing group of women. I don't want you to think that I work alone. I don't. I work with a brilliant, creative, powerful group of men and women, and Janice is a part of that. I'm so proud to call her one of my best friends. And I took this, I said, I can't walk away from this man. I can't. It's against our laws. And so we said, okay, let's fundraise for him. And we were stumbling around. We didn't know what we were doing half the time, but we just knew that we couldn't leave this man. So we fundraised, and then this organization from Manitoba came forward and volunteered to build him a home. And we came up with a tiny home for him. A mini home is what they're called. And that's his house right there. And so, you know, for the first year, I think it was first six to 8 months after giving him the house, I was living out there in a community. And I would watch him like go back to his chicken coop, and then he would go stay at this little house, and then he was going back and forth. And we were wondering, like, what's going on? And thank goodness one of the people that we work with has a psychology degree. And then she figured it out that when you dehumanize people long enough, when they don't believe that they're worthy of such a beautiful gift, that they don't feel like they deserve it. So I think that's what he was struggling with. And eventually, he did move in. And when I went to see him, he was painting it, made a little extension to it. He was making it into his home. For some point, he accepted that he is worthy of this. Something shifted in him, and he felt worthy and accepted it, which was very powerful, because a lot of our people really struggle with being dehumanized and dominated in these systems. And that's Baastamuin. Baastamuin is that verbal law, of course, you know, gossiping, profanity, all these different things that we are all pitiful in as human beings. We've all done it. I've done it. When no one is shielded from this law. And this is the one in particular that drove me. I'm all about land. If you know and follow me on Facebook, I'm all about land. Everything is about land to me. So when I went home and I was writing a chapter on my book about land, I had these fuzzy memories about the land, and I put my stuff in storage and I went home. And I was shocked. I was shocked at the devastation that was going on there. And Hayden has come out there and visited me, but I moved into the land. I moved there. I hauled a rickety old trailer, and I went and lived there. And I lived there for approximately 7 years. And I did it to protect the land, because I knew. And this image is, we told my dad, don't go there. Don't go there. And then one day, he decided he's going to go there. And this is the picture my brother took. and my dad finally seen the land. This is land that had been in my family for generations before any white people ever set foot there. We've hunted there, we've lived there, we have a shelter there, and where that shelter is located, two days walk in every direction is our hunting land. That's how we measure it. 2 days walk in every direction. And every family has that. Every family. The neighboring lands is my uncle, Wachehkwan. I don't know his English name, but his Cree name is Wachehkwan. His hunting lands are alongside ours. And we all know whose hunting land is where, all the families, and that's part of treaty. Hunting, gathering, fishing. We kept meeting with Saskatchewan Environment, and they kept telling us, no, we're not gonna take your trees. While we were in a meeting with them last year, they came and hauled away my trailers. And they did that while we were in a meeting with them. And now I'm gonna go to court because I violated their Parks Act. Lands that have been in my family for generations. My people are buried there. Those children that I talk about are buried there. So we're going to court come June. So if you see fundraising activities, you'll know that's what it's for. And again, this is Ochinimuin. This is when the hunters go and hunt, and they're grateful and they're thankful. They say prayers and they call out to the animals. That's Ochinimuin. There's women in my family. They're called Okichitauskook. And my great-grandmother was the first one who carried me and the midwife when I was born in a rickety old log house. And she carried me. She was the last Okichitauskook, but they're not gone. They still exist. They're the Lawkeepers in our nation. I came here to visit some of the lands, and this really impacted me only because there's 2 trees. There were 2 trees there. One was about 800 years old. The other one was 900 years old, and they're male and female. And I love those trees because they still carry the memory of a time when my people walked free, self-determined on these lands. And I put tobacco down, steam out for them, and I just love this image of them. And I keep it close to me because it's a reminder of what I want to strive for. So my nephew and I, we lived out on the land, and the land changed us. It was an incredible experience. Someday maybe we'll talk about it more in detail. But that one day, my nephew and I, we were running out of supplies, like, salt and pepper and all these things, and then we're gonna go into town. So we got into the truck, and we had already been on the land about, 2-3 months. And then my nephew, Gisik, his name is Gisik, we went into town, and then we said, we're gonna go get some stuff. And as we're driving into town, we're like, I'm gonna have pop, I'm gonna have chips and all this stuff. And then we got to the grocery store, and then we started buying all this stuff, and we're driving back to the land, and we're stuffing our faces, and I've got like a mouthful of chips, and we're just not talking to each other. We're just like, and then next thing you know, I had to pull over, and we started throwing up. Sorry, everyone, that's maybe overshare. But we started throwing up because the land changed us. Our body couldn't tolerate that food anymore. It just rejected it. And then as we're driving back, and Gisik, if you knew my nephew, he's got an incredibly funny personality. He likes to joke around. So we're driving to the land, and we're laughing, and we're making jokes. And then as we're pulling into our hunting land, the road that goes to our shelter, we were stunned. We stopped there and we paused. And here the signage, and it's just a symbolic blockade. We put this little sticks across the road and we put this sign right in the middle of the road that says, no trespassing, Treaty 6 lands. And then somebody shot it up. Somebody must have been watching us. I know they were watching us. I know they were. And we were gone about 4 hours. And if you know anything about weapons and guns, a .22 is not lethal unless you purposely aim for that person's head. It's not lethal. A rifle, however, is lethal. It's meant to kill. And those bullet holes on that signage are from a rifle. And so my nephew and I, we drove to the shelter, and we must have been in shock because I started building a fire, we started cooking, and we ate, we sat down, we're sitting there. And my nephew is only 12 at the time, and he says to me, and he's always serious. Well, I know when he's serious, you say, Auntie. And I'm like, yeah. And he says to me, you know that was a death threat. And I'm like, mm-hmm. And he figured that out. I didn't want to talk to him about it, but he figured it out on his own. He's like, that's a death threat. And he said, I don't want to be here. I want to go back to the reserve. And the reserve is about an hour and a half drive. So I'm like, okay, we'll go. So we left that night, and we went back to where I am on the reserve. And in the morning, he phones me up, and again, he's like, Auntie. I'm like, yeah. And he goes, let's go back. We have to go back. And I said, okay, let's go back. So we went back. We stayed right into the fall. But the good news is, we managed to save some of the forest. We did, when they came for the trees. We did save some of the forest. And I'll leave it there. And they're still, even as I'm standing here talking to you, they're still taking the trees. Even though it's a treaty term and promise that we have a right to hunt, to fish, to gather, they're still taking the trees. They're legislating our hunting and our fishing. And my people's lands, they're incredibly beautiful. They're beautiful. It's so beautiful that there's freshwater streams there that you can still drink from. You can still drink from that. You know, our children, they think that water comes from a tap. What is natural has become unnatural. Our children, our Indigenous children, have forgotten how to drink from the land. Sometimes, a lot of times actually, I would take my grandchildren to go drink from the land. And then when we can, we take jelly beans and we put them out for the little people. Because my mom told me the little people like jelly beans. So this one day, and it's stunningly beautiful there, there's this little freshwater stream that flows from the earth and comes over the land. And that's where I go and I meditate. And that's what I did. There was this big tree that fell across. And I thought, I'll go put jelly beans for the little people. So I put them on that tree. And then I went to the other end and I sat there and I started meditating. I was praying. Then I heard this noise. It's like squeak, squeak, squeak. And I open my eyes and I look across this fallen tree at the jelly beans. And here's this squirrel holding the jelly beans. And then I stood up. I'm like, Oaz. And then that squirrel's like squeak, 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 just arguing with me and holding the jelly beans. And I'm like, I want to see my, and I'm like, I went quiet, I'm like, oh my God, I'm arguing with a squirrel. So I like to think that I'm giving jelly beans to the little people, but really I think I'm giving cavities to the squirrels. So I really got to rethink my gifts to the land. So for over here, you have your fishing that's important to you. Out on the woods where my people are, the hunting, the fishing, the gathering, especially the hunting, is incredibly important. We can't live without it. It's an ethnocide. We know what genocide is. That we know that. But there's an ethnocide happening, and it's continuing on even as I'm standing here. And for the nation to nation, that's problematic for me standing here, because the Indian Act chief is making agreements on side with the colonizer to take the trees, and that's an issue. And I don't like to talk about that too much publicly, because that's our internal business, right? My focus is the colonizer manufacturing consent in complete violation of the title holders whose lands are being directly affected. That's my issue. That's who I'm targeting. Because poverty drives a lot of the agreements. And I understand that. I try not to get too angry at the Indian Act leadership. But my father is a hereditary chief, and it's not under the Indian Act system. And he stands unrecognized by the colonial systems. And I think that's one of the biggest issues here, is that the Indian Act leadership is elevated to be the people for the go-to for consent. And that's a big issue. Not all, but boy, way too many. Just way too many of them are giving consent, even on lands that don't belong under their jurisdiction. These lands that I'm talking about, they're off reserve. They're not on the reserve. They're off the reservation lands, and that's another issue. So I'm still out there, but now I signed a contract to be faculty at the Yellowhead Tribal College. So I'm reaching out to the young people, because I find that the older generation, my age, are too comfortable. Not all, but too comfortable in these systems. So I want to work with the young people to begin questioning, pushing back, abolishing, disrupting, resisting, defending, protecting what lands that are left. So that's my hope for the generation. And I'm not sure what that will look like, but I would really love to have these laws revitalized and enforced. People talk about the implementation of treaty. I think the dialogue should be the enforcement of the ones that are already there. Like, I want these lands protected. And what is that going to look like? Respecting our right to be there as the title holders to these lands. People think that the number of treaties only have those little posted size stamps for land. That's not true. That is not true. And that's the lie and the myth that the colonizer feeds to the people. This is a vast area, vast area. I'm not talking about 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles. I'm talking about hundreds of miles of beautiful boreal forest that's gone. It's gone. It's been clear cut. And people tell me, oh, it'll come back. Yeah, but not in my generation. And maybe not in my children's generation, maybe in my grandchildren's generation. And the way that the kind of trees that they're planting, it's not the way it should be. So today, I want to leave you with thoughts about the nation to nation. Is the nation to nation with AFN, Federation of Sovereign Nations, I think they're called now. I think we all really need to have these very difficult and challenging conversations about who's consenting. And we need to have that in our communities. And we need to inform people, because it sounds like a lot of people are not getting this information. They're in fear. Even the ones that have the information, they're in fear of repercussions that will happen in their own communities. I know that I'm in fear when I go to my own community, and I'm being very honest here. Like my own family suffers. Basic things like if my dad runs out of water at his house, they won't haul water to his house for 3, 4, 5 days. Little things like that. The Indian leadership is problematic, and it's not working. Mistaken no mina ka. That is all I have to say. May the Creator bless your home fires. And I shake hands with each and every one of you, and I'm thankful for your listening to me. Bixa.
Miigwech, Sylvia, and sorry about that. Let's be careful with these microphones. And Catherine, for those presentations, and contrasting presentations, but also in some ways sort of the same. You know, what's happening in the modern treaty context is maybe in the historic context, that's a future for the modern treaty context. I don't know. So I have a couple questions if nobody else has questions, but obviously if somebody else wants to add a question, just please throw up your hand. But Sylvia, maybe first, and I'll share with everybody that when I went to Sylvia's territory and I stayed in one of the trailers that she had on her lands, and I saw the graves of children that tried to run away from residential school, and the clear cutting, and the settlers who had built their little houses right up beside graveyards. I mean, that was a very profound experience for me seeing that. I mean, we know about settler colonialism, we talk about settler colonialism, it affects us on a daily basis, but that was really visceral for me to see it in those tones. And it sounds like you're confronting not only industry, not only the province, but you're also dealing with supposedly representative political organizations who are compounding the problem. And I know in your comments you said that you don't excuse them outright. You have some maybe, I don't know, sympathy for them or something. But is there any institutional, is there any use in engaging some of these chiefs and councils and some of these political organizations to lobby on our behalf for simple things like protecting treaty lands? That's my question. I don't mean it to be so black and white, but where I think it's important for us to decide where we put our energies.
I think they began with a dream and hope. These organizations did begin with a hope for change. But I think, like, there are situations where they can become co-opted. And I think that's what's happening. That's my opinion. And just to be clear, we all have relatives that are working in these systems. I do. And they think and they believe that the work that they're doing is for the benefit of the people. Perhaps it's true. But also, again, in my opinion, I have had no support from AFN. I have had no support from FSIN, and I've requested it. I've reached out to them, and they've remained silent. So as a grassroots person that's living on the land, my position standing over there, they've lost their vision. They've lost the vision of the grassroots people and are now pursuing the agenda of the colonizer in terms of joining the colonial economics of pursuing money and jobs. However, in saying that, I know there's bands that are doing the opposite of that. Like Muscatese is going to be completely powered with solar by 2019. How dang amazing is that, right? In a year from now, every one of their houses are going to be powered by solar. Even though they're an Indian Act band, they're not necessarily an organization. So there's hope, and I think with enough pressure from the grassroots people, we can remind these organizations once again, or maybe they need to be abolished. And if you follow me on Twitter, I created a hashtag that says dissolve AFN. So I think if an organization is refusing to follow the grassroots people's voices, I think they need to be either dissolved or reminded.
I guess in relation to Inuit resistance, like there are communities that have not signed on to self-government agreements, right? They're not joining, they're not following that herd in that direction. There's such a difference categorically when you sort of take off all these layers of institutional function and the national organization. They're very busy. They're very busy, but they're very much doing the program work that the federal government wants to deploy across the Arctic versus sort of growing. And it's such small budgets when we looked at who the organizations are. The Inuit organizations at the core, those representative organizations have such small amounts of funds that they're able to allocate for their own interests, right? As opposed to the contracts and agreements that they're being told to use.
So, sorry, was there a question over there? Yeah, great.
You mentioned, my question is for, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Let me check. I'm gonna put my eyes on. Catherine. You mentioned that big corporations and global corporations are the main actors in what you see as being the problematics in your territory. I was hoping you could say more about that.
For sure. Well, there's the Arctic Council being one of the sort of large groups. So as Inuit, as the Arctic Council was being formed, Inuit were an afterthought and so received permanent observer status as a group in there. There's the Inuit Circumpolar Conference as well to put some meat in there about how it is that Inuit across all of these artificial nation states can unify because it's the herds continue to cross, whether it's a land animal or the sea animals, and then just the persistent organic pollutions that all of the Arctic faces in terms of accumulated pollution is quite intact. And so amongst these nations, Arctic nation states, for example, with Norway, and just recently Clyde River was able to call the National Energy Board for not consulting with them because they were doing some sonic testing in between Canada and Greenland. So these are corporate entities who had licenses, 5-year licenses from the National Energy Board to do this testing, and it would make the seals deaf, and it was also the time of year when the beluga were coming to calve. So not good times, right? And so they've had to invoke a lot of the other court systems to oppose these injunctions to make these processes stop. So there's definitely, and I guess the reason why the companies are looking at the seabed is because they want to map for some oil resources down there, right? Because as the Arctic is melting, all these new opportunities are arriving. So this is where there's lots of diplomatic and other Arctic nations are pursuing their sovereignty claims, and I guess previous designations about the waterways were international, but now that they're passages, there's potentially they're having a pissing match. I can say that, right? So I don't know if that helps answer.
It does, because I think that's where Sylvia, where the I Don't Know More movement, sort of those kinds of things are intersecting, right? So what the inspiration was for the I Don't Know More movement was the water issue. So that's where I see that. I'm trying to parallel that. So thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Or Hayden, did you have another question?
Not if somebody else has something to say. Anybody? Russ, you wanted to say something at the end of the last panel about treaty-related comment?
The comment I wanted to make was about the federal role in this whole thing about recognition of these different groups who are popping up, like the Mi'kmaq and that, who are claiming to be Aboriginal or Indigenous. Guillaume Carl, another guy from Quebec that likes to dress up in chokers and buckskin and that. Darryl was just telling me he's got one ancestor back to 1635 or something. That's his Indigenous ancestor. But the thing I was going to say about the federal role is they are not transparent in how they recognize groups. For example, they have the power to create new bands under the Indian Act, Section 2. And they created the Halapu Band in Newfoundland a few years ago. And they had 100,000 Newfoundlanders apply to be a member of that band. They didn't set up a reserve, because that would mean more services and monies, because that you'd be eligible for if there was a reserve. So they just created a band. And when 100,000 of them applied, they sent in this old bureaucrat named Fred Caron to start figuring out how to cut people off on the applications. And they started to come up with these criteria about you had to show some evidence that you were connected to the territory. You know, I've never heard of any Indian band having to do that in the country. But this is a new band that they created in Newfoundland. So I bring that as an example up about where the feds can use their federal recognition, to fulfill their objectives. And the Algonquins of Ontario is another example. Darryl was mentioning there. I work for 3 Algonquin governments. 2 of them have what's called overlaps in that Algonquins of Ontario land claim area. They object to that land claim. Pikwakanagan is the only status Indian Algonquin community there. They created 9 satellite groups. He mentioned a judge, but really it was a retired Ontario judge. It wasn't in court. They brought him in to look at the criteria for enrolling these Algonquins. And that's where they came up with this 10 or 12 root ancestors. But our tribal council, the one I work for, the Algonquin Nation Secretariat, looked at the genealogy of about 3,000 of the 7,000 so-called Algonquins of Ontario. and found they hadn't intermarried with Algonquins in 200 to 300 years. But they're defined as an Algonquin under the definition of that negotiation process. And the reason why the feds want that is because they want them to extinguish title to the Ottawa Valley, particularly the National Capital Region, because Ottawa is on basically stolen Algonquin land. They call it unceded, but it's basically stolen. And they want to clear title to it because it's embarrassing for them to hear everybody say Parliament Hill is on Algonquin territory or the Supreme Court's on Algonquin territory. So the feds do have a lot of power in determining, you know, who they're going to recognize. That's why I could say that this Prime Minister's law to recognize and implement rights, he's weaponizing recognition because they get to define what they're recognizing. And they can create these new bands. You know, the reason why they didn't create bands in the Algonquins of Ontario there was 9 groups, is because then they'd have to spend more money on reserves, and they're trying to get rid of reserves. In fact, Pikwakanagan, they want them to negotiate a self-government agreement where they're going to give up the Golden Lake Reserve and their tax exemption. And Pikwakanagan voted, the Status Indians voted a majority against, in a referendum, this agreement in principle. But because they're part of this Algonquins of Ontario group, their chief and council is still proceeding to negotiate a final agreement, even though their own people voted in a majority no to proceed. And the government went ahead and signed the agreement in principle on Parliament Hill behind security in order to continue on with those negotiations. And that's the Trudeau government doing that. So all the while that he's talking about, you know, nation to nation and reconciliation and all these nice words, on the ground, they're proceeding with extinguishment and termination. They call it modified rights, but that's another legalistic weasel wording way of saying de facto extinguishment. So, you know, you gotta, when all these groups are popping up and the feds are, they have their objectives in playing groups off against each other, and it's basically recolonization, you know. That's what I wanted to say about the federal role and all this pretendian stuff. Thank you.
So maybe we'll wrap up then. Please join me in thanking Sylvia.